with us today to talk fatherhood.
Mate, what a joy. Thank you for having me on the show.
All right, so tell me a bit about the journey that you've gone on with your kids that inspired you to write the book Intentional Father.
So it actually goes back before I had my son. I was a youth pastor and I was watching how formation happened with different Christian groups and came across how the Mormons raise their young people and realized, oh my gosh, this is so much more robust and intentional than how we do it. And I was an evangelical youth pastor at the time. So it made me determine when I have my son, I feel like I have to sort of design some kind of process that I'm unfamiliar with, that I'm sure other times and places in history have done. And I have to sort of like break a generational curse or build a bridge or something. I've got to do something I never received. And I don't really know anyone who has received this. So I did a bunch of research and basically realized all societies, bar late modern society, has had a formal sort of 6-step shared process of how they walk young people from adolescence into adulthood. And so I basically did the research on that, built that out, and then took my son through it for 6 years. So from when he turned 13 until he was 19, we went through this conscious, clear, intentional pathway to walking from adolescence into manhood. It involved daily stuff, monthly stuff, big challenges, wild trips. It closed with us hiking 500 miles across Spain after he did the gap year to do the Camino de Santiago together, and ended with a big blessing ceremony after he'd been through everything. So yeah, it was a it was an attempt to bring the best of other cultures absent in our culture into the life of my son. And while I was doing it, I had a lot of other folks like, hey man, I got a teenage boy. I'm sort of like struggling here. I've read a few books, but it feels like there's massive holes in what they're offering. Can you put some thoughts together? And that's ultimately what it resulted in being a resource.
And of course, you look on this process really fondly, and I'm going to assume that your son Nate does as well.
He does indeed. I mean, if he's done one or two little convos about it, like, hey, what did you get out of it? And he said something to me the other day. He's gone back to school now. But when we were together, he said this to me. We are talking about childhood memories. What are some of your favorite childhood memories? And we were going through all the apartments in New York City that we'd lived in. And, like, hey, what stood out to you at that time? And what stood out to you at that time? And then he stopped and he said this to me. He said, hey, Dad, I just want you to know that you're a good dad. When I go back into my life and I look at all the memories I know kids are supposed to have, I have every one of them because of your intentionality. Thank you.
Hmm.
And I was like, oh gosh, man. I mean, that's what else can you hope for to come out of the mouth of your son? That was unprompted. It was just his reflection, like,
Hmm.
hey, Dad, I know something was meant to happen and it happened. Thanks for being intentional with it.
As you looked at these other processes that have existed in other cultures that you tried to kind of bring together to create this process of being an intentional father, obviously one of the goals is hopefully to have the response that your son did to that process, that he sees it positively and he looks back at you and says, yeah, you were a good dad, you hit the mark. But apart from that, what was the outcome you were aiming for? What were you looking for in your when all this was done? What was the aim for your son?
I think I wanted my son to feel loved and understood, and I wanted him to be prepared to face reality.
Hmm.
The teenage years are very, very confusing. They're a lot more confusing than when I grew up. You've got all of these bizarre energies that sort of hijack you: sexual energy, relational energy, vocational energy. All of this stuff is sort of like, where did this come from? It's taken over my life. And that can be very confusing times. Your brain is literally still developing. You're trying to figure out how to navigate romantic relationships, school relationships, power dynamics, accomplishments. And it can be a time where a lot of folks just feel misunderstood. I wanted my son to feel understood. Like, I get it, man. It's hard. It's okay. You're going to get through this. I wanted my son to feel loved, which is like, you're wanted, you matter. I see you, I care for you. And I wanted him to be ready to move into the world with a sense of confidence. Like, I can do this. Like, let me help with that. I can do this. I know how to do this. So that was my goal. I wanted him to be able to look back and be grateful and feel loved and look forward and go, okay, I think I've got what it takes to be able to navigate the complexities of early adulthood.
So why intentional fatherhood and not just intentional parenting? What's the unique gift that a father brings to their child?
Well, I believe in intentional parenting. The short answer is like I was a dad with a son, and
Right.
that was the task in front of me. I've
Yeah.
got something else I did with my daughter. She's in college as well now. I called that 50 pieces of my heart, 50 key deposits every dad needs to make in his daughter's life. So I did a whole different process with her that it was similar. I guess I could have bundled them together into generic principles, but I feel like that's what's actually
Hmm.
wrong with so much of our parenting is its generic principles.
Hmm.
And like I think people, in order to feel loved and seen and understood, you have to enter into who a kid is particularly, and gender and sexuality make very distinct differences in adolescent formation. And so
Hmm.
you have to be able to speak into these things. Like there's nothing more demoralizing for a young man to say, hey, what I'm about to teach you applies equally to your sister, but don't worry, it's great. It's going to like just demotivate him, you know? And
Right.
particularly, I mean, it started when he was 13. You're
Yeah.
going to demotivate him. And so I wanted to like have something that felt specific and necessary. I think that particularly during adolescent years, that a lot of very, very good formation happens with same gender relationships.
Hmm.
Like there's just a need to be understood. There's just a sense of like, hey, I've been through what you've been through. So you can be vulnerable. You can open your heart. You can share your struggles because I know what it's like to have gone through this.
Yeah.
If he was in a room with a bunch of teenage girls, he'd probably be like, preening a little bit, defensive. He certainly wouldn't share his weaknesses or his deepest struggles.
Yeah.
And so to really get the heart, I think there was something about me as a dad speaking to my son
Mm-hmm.
directly. There's larger sort of like, I think, maybe even theological reasons, there's biblical reasons, like there's biblical commands to raise your children in the fear and admonition of the Lord. So yeah, it was the task in front of me, biblical, personal, cultural. I try to lean into it. So
Yeah.
mothers, obviously, I mean, I love mothers. Mothers are vitally important. But
Yeah.
I would say we don't have a crisis of motherhood as much as we have a crisis of fatherhood in our culture.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that because in your book, you partnered with Barna for some really fascinating research. And what did they find about the state of fatherhood in the world right now, and why this processes like this, or really just fathers in general, are essential for sons?
Well, one of the big things they found is like half of all fathers don't feel equipped.
Hmm.
So there's two ways you can read it. Like, hey, 50% of dads doing fine. And, like most men probably answer their surveys a touch overconfident anyway. No, I'm killing this area of my life. Everything's great. But for half of them to admit like, hey, I got work to do here.
Yeah.
It's like, if there was any other issue in a church where half the people struggled with the issue, we'd really address it. And then I think some of the interesting things when you read the Barna research is the write-in comments. So it's not the stats or the graphs or the data. It's like, what did people say? And man, you can read some of the wounds that people have because of their fathers, very, very deep wounds. And then you read some of the empowerment, like the soul-stirring generational acceleration and blessing that comes from a dad who gets it right. So yeah, I think the big takeaway is this: the stakes are high and there's a huge need.
Yeah. In your book, you talk about 5 different types of fathers, everything from irresponsible fathers to intentional fathers, which is the title of the book. And you make the case, and the research seems to back it up, that an irresponsible father can leave wounds like no other, but on the flip side, an intentional father can empower like no other. But talking about that wound piece for a second, what are some of the wounds that we can carry from our relationships with moms and dads that then influence how we parent? Because we can only use the blueprint that we're given, right or wrong, right? That's what we all start from. So what are some of the wounds we carry, and how do they affect our parenting poorly?
Well, I mean, Jung basically says when he talks about childhood psychology, that there's probably 3. So the greatest burden any child has is the unlived life of the parents. So like you see this a lot in New York, and you probably see it in Texas in high school sport pressure. You know what I mean? Like on the and academics, but there's that kind of parent who's trying to relive and improve their life through their kid, heaping on expectations, projecting into them, not asking the question, who is this kid and who do I want him to be? So I think that is one of the big wounds. But what Jung's main idea is that childhood wounds come in 2 forms. You're not nourished properly, like you're not literally cared for properly, so you have huge deficits when it comes to relational connection, or you're not protected properly, which
Mm,
means you develop fear and control instincts because your parents didn't create an environment of safety and protection.
mm,
So if you think about this as like people are not nurtured properly and people are not felt safe, well, you develop like coping mechanisms and profound systems to sort of like either medicate that disconnection, and so that can happen with either redoing this, sort of loose attachments, redoing being emotionally unavailable, redoing sort of distance, fear of intimacy, or overcompensating, which means you become codependent, you're hyper dependent. So the nurture piece is very important, or you become a control freak, which is basically trying to keep yourself safe. You perceive everything as a threat. And
mm,
so you don't have a generous or open posture to life. Everything is fear management. And so if we get that from our parents when we're young, that will often show up in how we build our lives. And we will have built very, very complex coping structures and mechanisms. And our kids just slot into those mechanisms. So I actually advocate almost 20% of the book plus is about you making sense of what you've been through so that you can take the good parts and intentionally bring that into the life of your kids, and then consciously blocking and removing those broken parts so they don't fly down by default. But you absolutely hit the nail on the head, man. Childhood formation is impacting us way, way more than we're aware of. I want to make that conscious and unmask it so we can come to
mhm.
terms with it and then, do the right thing with it.
Yeah. On the positive side of the spectrum, in terms of looking at dads, you talk about involved fathers, and then more the ideal being that intentional father. There may be a good number of guys listening who are like, I'm a pretty good dad. Like I'm probably that involved father. Like my wife gives me praise, my kids seem to love me. I'm at all the games. I know what's going on in their life. I'm an
Mm.
involved father. Talk to me about the difference between being an involved good dad and being an intentional father. What's that gap, and how do we bridge it?
Well, I just want to say, if you're an involved dad, I mean, standing ovation. It's the minority of fathers.
Yeah.
So, having the sex talk, teaching your kids to drive, navigating bullying, giving them a sense of identity. These are powerful things. And I really, really honor dads who have done the work to be present like that in their kids' lives. I can give you a story from my own life that I think illustrates the difference. Involved dads do general wisdom and worldview really well.
Mm,
Hey, here's how life works. Hey, here's the big things you need to get right. And here's who God is and how faith sort of works. That's what an involved dad does. And if you get like a general sense of how life works and who God is, and like, man, you're going to be doing better than the majority of people in the world today. But an involved dad goes one step further. He asks the question, how do I win my kid's heart?
mm,
And who has God made this person to be? And that's going to require intimacy and specialization. It's going to go beyond general wisdom and worldview into specific calling and challenges.
mm,
So, the example, I've always in my life had some sort of leadership influence. I'm a pretty strong personality. I'm pretty driven. I've always been an upfront kind of person. So when I was young, and I was pretty gifted. So when I was young, I did well academically. I did well in terms of sports. And my dad would always say to me, don't be proud. Don't be proud. Don't get a big head. Don't become arrogant. Now, the truth is, behind that gifting was like a bizarre sense of insecurity. I still to this day am a reluctant leader, which means I'm the guy you have to drag to the stage, not the guy you have to fight to get the mic from. I'm very, very happy to let other people lead and empower others. And so if my dad knew that I was primarily struggling with insecurity and not pride, he wouldn't have said all the time, don't be proud, don't be proud, don't be proud. He would have said, go for it, step up, have courage, take heart, lean in.
mm,
So general wisdom was like accomplishments make you arrogant, and God's opposed to the proud. But if he really knew, he would have said like, he would have given me those Joshua into the promised land. Take heart, be strong and very courageous. God is with you wherever you go. So I think just that's the difference. My dad wasn't involved, dad, but the difference between winning my heart and
mm.
understanding the dynamics. And then that has impacted me. It's produced a hesitancy, an unintentional hesitancy in my life that I've wrestled with for 25 years.
Mm.
Well, I don't want to be arrogant. I don't want to be prideful. I don't want it to be about me. And so I've underled at times because of like a few potent comments that were true in general, but not customized to what was happening in my heart. And I don't say that to shame my father.
Hmm.
My dad did so much better than his dad did. But it's just an example of that you close the gap by finding out who your kid is, what he's wrestling with, what his unique struggles are, and then how do you bring specific customized wisdom and insight.
Hmm.
I guess, maybe like on a practical level, it would be the difference between I downloaded a workout program from the internet that is absolutely true about nutrition and fitness, and having a customized trainer who walks with you and sees your body in motion and then specifically designed things to maximize your potential. Health is good. That a customized training will help you become what general fitness will never enable you to be.
Yeah. So there's an importance to just, I mean, to try and state it as simply as possible, remaining curious about your kids and just trying to get into their heart and mind and figure out what they're wrestling with, what they're struggling with, what they're thinking about. And then I love what you said. It's also a specialization of your wisdom and of your activity toward them, specializing it for them. Jon, there's probably somebody listening who is saying, "Man, I would love to do this, but I got zero I got zero bandwidth for it. I'm barely like showing up to all the things I'm supposed to be at as a parent, as a spouse, and in my other vocations." What do you say to the father who's like, "Sounds great, Jon. I'm glad you got to do that with your kid. I've got all these things fighting against me that seem like it makes it impossible for me to be a more intentional father."
Well, I mean, I have two things. I have a hard thing and I have a kind thing. They're both true. The hard thing is this: if you're too busy to raise your son, you're too busy.
Mm.
You've got a problem that is bigger than your parenting. You've got a problem called you're living the wrong life.
Mm.
And you probably have to go deep into the structure, rhythms, habits, and values of your whole life.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's like, hey, look, I just don't have time to help my son navigate the complexities, well, then you are consciously choosing to sow brokenness into a future that you will have to deal with later.
Yeah.
It's like I wish I could soften it, but look at the brokenness of our world today. Look at the despair, suicide, depression, anxiety amongst this current generation. We are at epidemic levels of depression and anxiety with our current generation. So, in some sense, you don't have the luxury of just being really busy in the middle of a crisis.
Yeah.
On the other side, I would say it probably doesn't take as much as you think. It's not called the super stressed out, overworked dad. It's called the intentional dad. And so this means that when you move towards them on purpose, when you're asking questions instead of tuning out, when you put your phone down and you lean in and listen, you never know what doors will open for influence and understanding. I did do some cool big things with my son. I did do some cool things. I wanted to. It's my personality. It's who my son was. We did some epic stuff. But when I ask him, he's 21 now. When I ask him, like, what's the stuff you remember the most? It really surprises me. It was a few conversations that didn't seem big to me that were like divinely timed, and they happened because I was available. And so I guess I would just say move towards your kids with intentionality. You never know what God will do. So again, I remember, and it could be as simple as like listening, paying attention to repeated phrases, the tone of a voice, how many times they mention a particular friend or class. These things, they're giving you information about the cry of their heart. And I remember the Stephen Covey quote. He said, a man came up to him very, very frustrated. And he said, I don't understand my son. He won't listen to me. And Stephen Covey said, say that again. I don't understand my son. He won't listen to me. He said, say that again. I don't understand my son. He won't listen to me. And Covey says, stop right there. In order to understand someone, you have to listen to them. And to me, that is the key. It's how do we create space to hear the cries of our kids' hearts. So yeah, move towards them with intentionality and see if God doesn't open up doors. And I think that could really change family dynamics.
How powerful of a force is guilt in the heart of fathers? I mean, in your own life, and certainly in working on this book and conversation with other dads, do a lot of dads wrestle with guilt over the father they know they should be and they know they're not?
Well, I actually don't. I think people wrestle with shame more than they wrestle with guilt. So, guilt is like I've done something wrong or I haven't done something. Shame is more about there's something wrong with me. And I think there's a lot of dads who feel like I just there's something fundamentally wrong with me as a father. I don't know how to do this. Like I this wasn't done for me. I'm inadequate. So it's not even like it's behaviorally oriented, it's heart oriented. It's just like I don't know how to do this. So I think one of the big things that is connected to that is to be able to say, "Hey, man, that's again why I'm advocating." A big chunk of the book is doing the work on yourself, and that's what kids are. If having a kid doesn't put the fear of God in you, nothing will. And if you don't see children as like the greatest opportunity of formation in your relationship with God to help fill in the gaps and deal with some of your pain, that's why I think God's designed it. Kids are a gift to us because they make us wrestle with our own story. So it does, on some big archetypal level, make us go, who is my father? Who am I as a child? Have I received divine love in such a way that I truly believe my shame is gone? It says in the book of Psalms, those who look to him are radiant. They'll never be put to shame. And it's like, is my eyes on my failure, my mistakes, my inadequacies, or is my eyes on him? Because that's where my face is lifted and glory comes through my life. So it is a dominating factor. Again, I'm not advocating for try harder, do more. I'm advocating for intentionality, which is a completely different framework. Because if your heart's not right, spending more times with your kid because you quote unquote have to or should will not be that enjoyable for you or them.
Hmm.
Kids smell obligation a mile away.
Hmm.
And so, it's like, let God do the work of healing in your heart. Enjoy the time you have with them and keep pressing into fullness in your relationship with God. Use it as an opportunity for formation and deepening your relationship with God.
So there's a centrality of the gospel for fathers in all of this that is going to make their own movement towards their kids
Yeah.
that much healthier, as what I hear you saying.
Mm. Yes, no, that's exactly it. Yeah. And again, kids are one of the gift of children is they confront this in us.
Hmm.
Your children, like people say, like getting married will make you holy. I'm like, let me tell you what will make you holy. Parenting.
That's right.
Your spouse will love you and accept you, but when you see, like there was one time, I became a Christian in Australia when I was a teenager, and I worked in a meat factory. Meat factories are environments where foul language is like it's so normal, and so I came out of that with some unsanctified speech. And one day when my daughter was like, she was 1.5, maybe, she had high heels on and a diaper and a purse. And she walked through our living room singing a swear word she'd heard in a song that she'd heard me say and turned it into a Disney song. And my wife looked at me and said, she got that from you. And I was like, I get it. And I changed my speech because I saw in my daughter as a child the brokenness I hadn't dealt with. So I think that's the gift that kids give us, the opportunity to really grow and lean into our relationship with God.
It's an opportunity for us to lean into our relationship with God, and yet, my sense is that a child's relationship with their parent, and perhaps even particularly their father, forms their conception of God. So talk to me a little bit about that. I mean, what role does a father in particular play in forming their child's understanding of who God is?
Well, it's obviously profound. It's obviously profound. I think, wired into the grain of the human soul is a desire for intimacy with someone who blesses us and empowers us. There's something in our spirits that we need to hear at a fundamental, almost DNA level. You are loved and you can do this.
Hmm.
And ultimately, that is of divine origin. We're made in the image of God. We're very good. And we are entrusted with dominion and a vision to make something beautiful of creation. And the gospel is saying to us in Jesus, you're not only very good, you're being renewed in the image of the Creator, and that you will rule and reign as kings and priests in a new heaven and a new earth. It says, to him who loved us and by his blood has freed us and will make us to rule as kings and priests. That's our destiny. And so our earthly fathers should be those who are giving us, who are echoing the divine affirmation and raising us up to our full potential. And so we get our view of God based on how well we sort of live these roles out. And again, maybe the greatest gift we can give to our kids in being a father is to say, no matter how well I do, there is somebody you must know who is your true father, who is infinitely better than I. I would say to my kids growing up, on my best day, on my most intentional day, I am a mist and a shadow of the great love that is your heavenly Father. Mm-hmm. Yet he can give you more than I ever could. And look at how much I want to give this to you. He is order of magnitude more kind and gracious and loving and present in your life. So primarily the biggest role a dad does is connect his children to the heavenly Father.
We talked about some of the things inside of a father that can get in the way of them being as intentional as they possibly can be. What are some of the forces all around us and outside of us that are making it more difficult just for families to be families, but in particular for dads to be the kind of dads that they need to be?
Well, honestly, mate, it's there's many factors, and it's a complex web, because if it was one thing, we'd all just do it and everything would be better.
Yeah.
But I would put it under the heading invasive technology. Yeah. Invasive technologies are just are making it almost impossible on several levels. Number one, it's rewiring our brains. Like, Nicholas Carr's book, The Shallows, like it's literally reducing our attention spans and capacity to pay attention, to be present. Number two, the omnipresence of devices with alerts. If it's not your computer, it's your iPad. If it's not your iPad, if it's your phone. If it's not your phone, it's your watch. If it's not your watch, it's Alexa. Everywhere you go, you're being intruded on. We would never tolerate a world where some stranger knocked on the door, came in and yelled out something. Can you imagine, like, someone right now knocks on your door and just comes in and says, Joe Biden has just made an announcement about the economy, and walks out? You'll be like, close the door. I'm trying to get something done. Yet we all consciously enable that in every area of our life. Like I walked around yesterday, the city of New York. Photography is like one of my hobbies, just try and, see the individual in the midst of the city. And it was very hard to do street photography, because all street photography is a picture of people on the street looking at their phones. It's hard work to get a photo of someone who's not looking at a phone these days. So yeah, that complex web, and then therefore that is speeding up our communication. It's drawing our kids to a collected web of relationships outside of the home. So like they're always being drawn out of a relationship with their family. It's impacting our capacity to travel. It's hyper scheduling. All of these things produce a web where the idea of like being still and sitting with one another is kind of like, oh, that's quaint. That just doesn't work in real life. Mm-hmm. And it's like, hey, hyper connected technology is not real life. Mm-hmm. It's a life that we've allowed to happen to us. So again, intentionality, which is like the big thing, is like default or design, on purpose or by accident. Somebody's going to shape your family culture. Why not the way you want? Somebody's going to choose your schedule. Why not build it around your values? Somebody's going to raise your child. Why not you with your love? I think the way we move back from that is not shaking our hands in resignation. It's putting up boundaries and say, I'm pushing back based on these intentional vision and values. And it's very, 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 very small things can make a massive difference. And on a very practical level, iOS 15, if I'm assuming, an Apple bias here, but iOS 15 has staggering new focus capacities where even the alerts are shielded. So when you look at your phone, you don't even see that you've got a text message. Like that to me is breakthrough technology for our actual quality of life. And then you can set it up where your kids can get through to you. So you can customize it if you're worried about not being able to reach your kids. So yeah, I think it's that complex web of invasive technologies that create a culture that feels like you're Amish if you don't go with it. But let me tell you, the second you get out of it, everybody will be like, help me. They all hate it too.
Yeah.
So
I think a lot of dads, they'll hear, for example, what you just said about technology, and they'll say, "Yeah, I feel it. Technology is invading every aspect of our lives and hijacking it, and it's discipling me and my family, not me discipling me and my family, right?" And yet, getting a handle on the tech piece can feel just like impossible, because they first have to get a handle on it for themselves and then try to maybe impose something on their kids, or and I think, at least maybe I'm just speaking for myself, a lot of times what gets in the way is this sense of hypocrisy in myself, of like, how can I try and instill something in my child, in my son, that I'm just so deeply struggling with and profoundly imperfect on in my own life. What do you say to the dad for whom hypocrisy gets in the way of getting going with intentional fatherhood?
Well, I think, number one, just be ruthlessly honest with who you are. Like, pretending you're doing better off than you thought isn't helping. So I always think about Dallas Willard's, like vision, intention, and means. This is how change really happens. Like, you got to have a burning yes. Without vision, the people perish, or as it says in the King James, cast off restraint. You stop restraining without vision. So it's very, very important to ask the question, what sort of relationships and quality of life do I want? And you get to hold that in front of you. It was like a burning vision. It's like, I refuse to have a shallow, lukewarm, mediocre, obligation-based marriage. I refuse to have kids who won't pay attention to me, who are looking at their phones during breakfast, who make no eye contact, and who are gone every night for sports. Like, I want a vision of a family that lasts together, that's vulnerable with one another, that's filled with rich traditions, that has a healthy ecosystem of life that people step into and say, what is this counterculture of joy and acceptance? And so to me, you got to get the vision of it. Then you got to have intention, which is cultivating the will. And so you've got to strengthen your capacity to say yes. In many ways, that's a lot about sort of like our habits and our resolve. And it's like, that's when you begin to sort of restructure things. And then the means is, like, I think a lot of times about those boundaries. And so if you feel like a hypocrite because you've tried and you can't, the answer is this: you can't then. So do something different. Get out of the cycle of failure, which is like, I tried and I can't. I use this all the time. It's like vision, intention, means. Like, keeping the burning yes in front of you helps you say 1,000 no's. Really asking the question, why does this matter? And sitting with the rewards and the consequences of not doing this. And then coming up with small practical things that move towards this. Look, you don't have to be a Luddite. You don't have to be Amish. You can just say, which is what my family did. We did a phone stack during our meals. Everybody's phone goes in a stack and nobody's allowed to pick it up. And we will not have a single interruption during this conversation. And that may not seem like a loud thing, except now I have adult children and we go out to dinner. They still say, stack your phone, Dad. Stack your phone. It's still in their lives. They do it with their friends. So small things like that, I think, like the cycle of hypocrisy is like, try harder, get tired, quit, feel guilty, and then hear a talk and then try harder. Like, you got to re-examine the paradigm. To re-examine the paradigm.
So we'll end with this. You've mentioned multiple times in this conversation that the power of a father is the ability to speak blessing and empowerment into the lives of his kids. So to the fathers who are listening right now, who could use some blessing and some empowerment from a dad who's been there and written a book on it. What would you say to them real quick as we close, to bless them and empower them in this vocation?
I would say, do not let the enemy rob you of thinking that you can't do this, that your kids don't want this, and that this is impossible for you. You are destined by God to be an intentional father. You're destined by God. And if you ask the Holy Spirit, help me, that willpower is not going to get you through. It's got to be the help of the Holy Spirit. And I would just say, like, offer yourself to God in fresh surrender. Be honest with who you are. And then do what you can, not what you can't. Sometimes people say to me, like, I could never do that. And I'm like, well, then don't try then, because that'll kill you. What can you do? Do that. It's the same principle with prayer. Pray what's in you, not what ought to be in you, says C.S. Lewis. Authentic prayer is what we really feel towards God. It's the same thing I would say, like, do what you can. If you can't do an hour a month, do 10 minutes a month. And you'll be amazed how those small seeds of faithfulness change a generation, change your kid's heart. And you will gain confidence over the course of time by those small, potent acts of consistency and intentionality. So you renounce the lies, receive the Father's love, and move forward in humility. God will meet you here and change is possible.
Jon, thanks so much for taking the time to talk with us today. And thanks so much for sharing your journey in fatherhood with all of us.
What a joy. Thanks so much, mate.